Let's break down our must-add players from the waiver wire here in Week 12 of the fantasy season. All right, we're going to kick it off with Emanuel Wilson of the Green Bay Packers. 13.9 fantasy points in Week 11, 11 touches, 40 yards on the ground, a touchdown, 1 catch for 9 receiving yards in relief of Josh Jacobs, who's now dealing with a knee injury, and Emanuel Wilson sits at just 12% rostered. Okay, so with this injury to Josh Jacobs, it's not expected to be serious or season ending. That's the only report I have at the time we are recording this, but I don't really know what that means. And obviously, as the days start to progress here, we'll get a better understanding. But by the time this video releases, we probably won't have a very clear understanding. So for now, Emanuel Wilson looks to be the lead back for the Green Bay Packers, and this is a Packers team that runs the football at an immense rate. They use the running back position a ton. So Emanuel Wilson is going to be a very valuable player. Only sits at 12% rostered, a decent enough matchup in Week 12 against the Minnesota Vikings. But I will say it's a pretty tough end of season schedule here for the Packers. The Vikings, the Lions, the Bears, the Broncos, the Bears again, and the Ravens. But there will be opportunity here. But once again, we don't know how long Josh Jacobs is going to be out for. But if you guys are hurting at the running back position, Emanuel Wilson becomes an absolute must-add player off of the waiver wire as we approach Week 12 of the fantasy season. Next up, we have Sean Tucker of the Tampa Bay Buccaneers. 34 fantasy points in Week 11, 106 yards on the ground, 5.58 yards per carry, 2 rushing touchdowns, 2 catches for 34 receiving yards, and another touchdown. He had a monster game against one of the worst run defenses in the NFL in the Buffalo Bills. Now, there's a couple things to kind of break down here, right? We don't know if Bucky Irving's going to play in Week 12 or not is kind of the big one here. And I don't really feel like the Buccaneers want to rush Bucky Irving back, obviously, because his status has just been up in the air for like half the season now. But they obviously have a 1-2 punch without Bucky Irving between Sean Tucker and Rachaad White. Now, obviously, Sean Tucker was the more viable option this past week. He saw 21 total touches, but we still saw 13 touches to Rachaad White as well, who still had success running the football against the Bills with 5.1 yards per carry. Now, elephant in the room for anyone who was watching last week's video, I was really high on Rachaad White this past week due to the matchup against the Bills, and I did get a lot of comments about Sean Tucker as well. So all the Sean Tucker truthers, here's your moment. You guys were right and I was wrong. But at the end of the day, I mean, Sean Tucker still only sits at 30% rostered. And I will go ahead and say this as well. There's a lot to break down here, okay? He will not have the same success in Week 12. And quite frankly, I don't think Rachaad White or Bucky Irving is going to have a ton of success either in Week 12 as they are on the road against the Rams, arguably the best, if not the best, run defense in the entire NFL right now, and a top 5 unit in terms of fantasy points allowed to the running back position. They have been really tough against the running back position all year long. So it's a much tougher matchup this week, but this will still be a good competitive game script, and the offenses will still be doing their best throughout the course of this game to put up points. So really, I just don't know if Sean Tucker is going to be a player you can really trust in Week 12. If Bucky Irving's back, then I don't really know that I would trust him at all. And if Bucky Irving's not back, it's a really tough matchup against the Rams. But he is worth adding. I will point out that in 2024, last season, Sean Tucker had 34.2 fantasy points in Week 6 and then had 8 or less fantasy points in every other game on the season and 4.8 or less in every other game except for 1 for the rest of the season. So stark comparison here, very loose, but maybe worth monitoring. I just don't know how to look at it for Week 12. We don't know if Bucky's going to play or not. It's a much tougher matchup. The Bills have given up the most rushing touchdowns of any team in the NFL, where the Rams have given up top 5 fewest. So it's just a really tough matchup. But at the end of the day, he's still worth rostering until further notice. But I really feel like we're just not even going to be able to start him in fantasy when Bucky Irving returns. And that could be as soon as Week 12 of the season. Let's talk about Kenneth Gainwell of the Pittsburgh Steelers, sitting at 53% roster, 29.5 fantasy points in Week 11. Just 24 yards on the ground, but he had 8 targets, 7 catches, 81 receiving yards, and 2 receiving touchdowns against the Cincinnati Bengals. And we saw another injury. This one was an ankle issue with Jaylen Warren, who still had 12 total touches in this game, but was not able to finish the game. And we were still seeing early touches to Kenneth Gainwell as well, but obviously Gainwell's fantasy value was increased with the fact that Jaylen Warren was not able to return to the game. So here's another, this is very similar to Sean Tucker we just talked about, right? Kenneth Gainwell faced the Cincinnati Bengals, who are like historically bad against running backs so far on the season. I've given up the most fantasy points to running backs on the season so far. In week 12, we'll be on the road against the Chicago Bears, who've been kind of middle of the pack. They've had really bad moments. They've improved slightly as the season has gone on, and they're still an opportunistic defense at the end of the day. So I don't think Kenneth Gainwell is going to repeat this performance in week 12, but if Jaylen Warren is due to miss time, Gainwell is worth picking up, especially with much softer matchups coming up in the following weeks against the Buffalo Bills and the Baltimore Ravens, then the Miami Dolphins. But then we have another issue here. Aaron Rodgers dealing with a wrist issue in his left wrist. And we saw some Mason Rudolph this past week. Sorry, not Kenny Pickett. And so I don't really know what to expect out of this offense over the next coming weeks as well. But at the end of the day, volume is king. Offenses can always surprise us. It's the NFL, so there will be opportunities for whomever the lead back for the Steelers is. And based on last week, if Jaylen Warren is due to miss time, it will be Kenneth Gainwell in week 12. Next up, let's talk about Zonovan Knight of the Arizona Cardinals. 14.5 fantasy points in week 11, just 5 touches on the ground, but 24 rushing yards, 4.8 yards per carry, 4 targets, 4 catches, 21 receiving yards, sits at 27% rostered. He also had a really long touchdown run in this game that was called back due to holding, so you can kind of add that. But Amari DeMarcado dealing with an ankle issue. He missed most of this past week. We saw very small volume to Michael Carter, but worth noting that Michael Carter did have 7 targets and 5 total catches. And then the elephant in the room, Trey Benson, could return in week 12, but who knows? The reports around him have been pretty murky. I think there's a strong chance that Trey Benson does return. In that circumstance, he sits at 69% rostered. He's worth picking up if available in your league, but a lot of people have been kind of stashing him on IR and whatnot. So I would just say if Benson misses this coming week, DeMarcado still dealing with the ankle issue. This is not a great matchup against the Jaguars, but still a matchup where Zonovan Knight's probably going to see RB1 volume, maybe with some sprinkles of Michael Carter. But once again, this depends on the health of Trey Benson and if he plays in week 12 or not. But Zonovan Knight, double-digit fantasy points this past week. If he's the guy in week 12 and what's been a very back-and-forth backfield when it comes to Arizona Cardinals, he could have some fantasy value here in week 12 of the fantasy season. Next up, we have Devin Singletary of the New York Giants sitting in just 44% rostered, 17.7 fantasy points this past week, is kind of quietly at 10 or more fantasy points in 2 straight games. 44 yards on the ground, 2 rushing touchdowns, and a catch for 3 receiving yards. Now, he wasn't incredibly efficient with just 2.75 yards per carry, but the fact that he got 2 touchdowns, you got to feel pretty good that he did that against the Green Bay Packers. Now, Tyrone Tracy had a total of 23 touches in this game, and he was much more fluent running the football with 4.63 yards per carry, and he did a lot more in the receiving game with 51 receiving yards off of 4 receptions, Then you look at the Giants' schedule here. I mean, they're on the road in week 12 against the Lions and on the road in week 13 against the Pats. You can't really feel good about either of those matchups, especially on the road. But Devin Singletary is getting, I think, a little bit more volume than a lot of people expected. Still had 17 touches this past week. And ultimately, whether it's Jackson Dart at quarterback or Jameis Winston, I think you got to feel pretty good. You might feel better if it's Winston because Jackson Dart does tend to run the football quite a bit himself. We'll see if he does or doesn't coming out of concussion protocol. But still, Devin Singletary, still pretty lowly rostered. He's seen volume. If you guys are hurting at running back, he's a waiver wire add as we approach week 12. All right, last running back I want to mention is Chris Rodriguez of the Washington Commanders heading into his week 12 bye week. Just 9.5 fantasy points this past week. 79 yards on the ground, though. 15 touches, 5.27 yards per carry. A catch for 6 receiving yards. And the important takeaway here is that he did lead the Commanders' backfield. Now, Ja'Cory Krosky-Merritt did have 10 total touches in this past game, so he is still getting involvement. And Jeremy McNichols had 6 total touches, so he's still sprinkled in as well in what is a very confusing and frustrating running back committee here. But Chris Rodriguez is the lead back here. We did talk about him in Friday's stash video for players that have very strong playoff schedules, and we've talked about him over the past 2 weeks or so. It's like he's kind of quietly the lead back. He's not ultra productive in fantasy football, but he's getting the most touches. And at the end of the day, volume is always king, like I've said throughout the video. Okay, so he has a bye week in week 12. Can't do anything this week with them. Then week 13, he gets the Denver Broncos, but then it's a little bit better on the road against the Vikings. The Vikings aren't like bad in terms of fantasy points allowed to running backs, but they do give up a lot of rushing yards to running backs. Then he gets the Giants, and then he's going to get the Eagles, which is tough, but then he gets the Cowboys. So if he's the lead back here at the end of the season, he's going to have at least 2 good matchups against the Giants and the Cowboys through the fantasy playoffs. He's sitting at 30% rostered. Maybe not my favorite ad moving into week 12, especially since he's on bye week, but he's still a player worth monitoring as the week progresses. All right, moving to the wide receiver position, let's start with Michael Wilson of the Arizona Cardinals, sitting at 39% rostered. He had a monster game in week 11 against the San Francisco 49ers with 33.5 fantasy points, 15 receptions off of 18 targets, 185 receiving yards. It's a day for him with no Marvin Harrison Jr. on the field, and quite frankly, Greg Dortch had a pretty nice day too with 18.6 fantasy points. He's worth a look, sitting at 5% roster. He did score a touchdown. Ultimately, though, I do want to say that the Cardinals were down against the Niners in this game, like 10 seconds into the game. I mean, the opening kickoff was almost a return for a touchdown by Sky Moore. Then Christian McCaffrey scored like 5 seconds later. And the Cardinals were playing from behind throughout this whole game, throwing the football with Jacoby Brissett at quarterback, setting an NFL record with 47 pass completions off of a whopping 57 passing attempts. So I mean, I just saying, you know, it might not look exactly the same way in week 12 against the Jacksonville Jaguars. I would expect more of a floor compared to a ceiling for both Michael Wilson and Greg Dortch. But at the end of the day, Michael Wilson is the lead target in terms of wide receivers on this team. Obviously, Trey McBride is the number one option here in terms of all pass catchers, but McBride, 11 targets, 10 catches this past week. Michael Wilson, 18 targets, 15 catches, like we said. So Michael Wilson is going to get involvement. Tougher matchup this week against the Jacksonville Jaguars, but they have struggled against the wide receiver position a little bit better against the run. They are opportunistic in terms of turnovers, but still, got to feel good here. He's the wide receiver one here until further notice, until Marvin Harrison Jr. is able to return from that appendix surgery that he had. And at that point in the season, I don't even know if he's going to actually return. So Michael Wilson, 39% rostered. I think he's an absolute must-add player, really regardless of what you need on your roster moving into week 12 of the fantasy season. Next up, let's talk about Mack Hollins of the New England Patriots, sitting at 16% rostered, 10.5 fantasy points in week 11, 5 targets, 4 catches, 64 receiving yards. He now has double digits in 3 of his last 4 games. And he's on the road here against the Cincinnati Bengals in a favorable matchup before another favorable matchup in week 13 against the New York Giants before that week 14 bye week for the Patriots. Now, I will say Kayshon Boutte has missed the last 2 games due to that hamstring injury. So when Boutte's back in the mix, I don't exactly know how this volume is going to look for the Patriots wide receivers, but we've obviously seen more involvement for Mack Hollins over the past 3 or 4 weeks, and especially in the games without Kayshon Boutte, we've seen at least 4 targets to Mack Hollins. I guess including the game, Boutte got hurt. Mack Hollins only had 2 targets in that game. But kind of the other issue here is the Patriots are just throwing the football a lot. I mean, they're actually running the football quite a bit as well. This is just a very fluid offense right now. So we do kind of just get the ball spread around, like Demario Douglas, Kyle Williams are going to have their targets. Hunter Henry's going to show up at times. Trayvon Henderson's going to score 3 touchdowns. Ramondre Stevenson could be back. And obviously Stephon Diggs is still the bona fide number 1 wide receiver here. But right now, Mack Hollins is just one of these guys. If you're hurting, you need a last minute flex option. If Boutte misses week 12, I think that Mack Hollins just one of these guys who gives you a safe floor off of the waiver wire. And Kayshon Boutte has kind of dropped to 44% rostered. He's another name, if he's back and healthy in week 12, could be another option off the waiver wire as well. So just stay posted for these New England Patriots wide receivers as the week progresses. All right, next up, I just want to mention Alec Pierce of the Indianapolis Colts coming out of his bye week, sitting at 58% rostered, had 14.8 or more fantasy points in 3 of his last 4 games, and he may have gotten dropped in your league just due to being on bye week and other necessities for the owner. But I mean, still sitting at 58% rostered. Out of the bye week, the Colts are going to get the Chiefs and the Texans, the Jaguars and the Seahawks. So a pretty tough schedule here, especially those first 2 games against the Chiefs and the Texans when we're looking at rankings against wide receivers. But this Colts offense has been great this year. They put up a lot of points. They can throw the football. They can run the football. So if Alec Pierce is out there and available, he's definitely worth a flex option. I would also say the same for Josh Downs, who sits at 55% rostered. So obviously both these players pretty highly rostered. But Josh Downs, double-digit fantasy performances in 4 out of the last 6 games that he's played in. So worth a look for all the same reasons that Alec Pierce is worth a look. I think Josh Downs maybe more of a floor play. Pierce has a bit more upside, but they're both in a very productive offense that has success through the air and on the ground, everything like I said. So Josh Downs, Alec Pierce, these guys may have gotten dropped in your league. Go check the waivers. They are worth adding moving into week 12. At the quarterback I want to talk about for today's video is Justin Fields of the New York Jets, sitting at 36% rostered, 19.3 fantasy points in week 11, just 116 yards through the air, but he did have a passing touchdown, 67 yards on the ground, and a rushing touchdown. Had a lost fumble, no interceptions. So pretty typical Justin Fields game here. Gets the Ravens here in week 12. It's a decent enough matchup, although this defense has been playing better, has been getting healthier. Then gets the Falcons, the Dolphins, the Jaguars, the Saints, and the Patriots. So kind of an up and down schedule here, but listen, I know it's Justin Fields. I know he had 7.9 fantasy points in week 10. I know Garrett Wilson is hurt. But Justin Fields is just one of these guys. He will show up. Is he going to show up every single week? No. Is he going to be matchup dependent? Yes, but it wasn't a good matchup this past week against the Patriots and still had a pretty solid fantasy day. Do I think he's the best option overall for your fantasy team? No, absolutely not. But is he a player that shows up in fantasy? Yes, he is. Is it hard to call? Yeah. But I still think that Justin Fields deserves to be rostered in more leagues than he is right now. I still think he's a good enough option in super flex double quarterback formats. He still brings upside to the table with his rushing ability. And at least we saw a little bit of something out of John Mechie this past week at the wide receiver position. And I know A.D. Mitchell wasn't good with just 1 catch, but he did show some separation as well. So I don't know. I'm not going to make excuses for the passing offense for the Jets. All I'm saying is Fields still has some upside on a week-to-week basis. His floor is very dangerous, but the upside is there at the end of the day. Just one tight end for today's video. That's A.J. Barner, the Seattle Seahawks, 17.1 fantasy points in week 11, 11 targets, 10 grabs, 70 receiving yards. He sits at 17% rostered, and A.J. Barner has been one of these names that I've just kind of left like in the streaming category throughout the course of the year in the start sit videos. And I mean, kind of comparable to Justin Fields, like his floor is pretty dangerous, but the upside is there on a week-to-week basis. We look so far on the season, he's given you single-digit fantasy games, 3.3 or less fantasy points 4 times on the year. Every other game, 10.1 or more fantasy points. He does have 4 touchdowns on the year and a rushing touchdown, 4 receiving, 1 rushing, and he's just involved in this offense at the end of the day. Can be tough to trust at times, but I think if you're hurting at the tight end position, maybe even if you're dealing with injuries still, like Tucker Kraft on IR, Sam Laporta headed to IR, and guys like Cade Otton or Dalton Schultz didn't really show up for you, you're still looking for other options. A.J. Barner could be that guy who's definitely available on the waiver wire. Might not be a guy for you every single week, but is at least an option in what is a really thin waiver wire option overall for the tight end position moving into week 12. Guys, have it. There are my must-add players from the waiver wire moving into week 12 of the fantasy season. Don't forget, guys, I'm answering as many fantasy football questions as I can in the comments down below, so please drop me your fantasy questions. I'll get back to as many of you guys as I can as the week progresses. While you guys are down there, does me a huge favor, helps out the channel tremendously. when you guys hit that subscribe button and that like button on the way out. When the videos and playlists pop up on the screen, don't forget we'll have everything you could possibly need here on the channel as the week progresses to absolutely dominate this week and every coming week of the fantasy season. So go check out all the content as the week starts to begin. And with that, I'll say thank you guys so much for watching and or listening. And remember, you saw it here on The Catch.